I've just been introduced, Alastair. I'm a director at KPMG in the European Sports Advisory Group, which is actually based in Budapest. The work we do ranges from advising on the sale of football clubs, hosting, bidding for large events, economic impact studies on various sports events, sports in general, and of course on sports infrastructure, and the very hot topic in Hungary, at least at the moment, of stadium development. Now, in the translation of how János introduced me, it said I was going to comment on the result of Friday's football match, and the great news is I'm not. The bad news was I was there. The good news is I'm a rugby playing, cricket playing, or not playing anymore, cricket watching golfer, and have no expertise in football whatsoever. But actually it was, for me, a very interesting experience, which was nothing to do with the score. And maybe I'll comment on that a little bit later. So the opportunity to make this presentation for us is, as KPMG is perfectly timed, because in the last week we released this publication, which I'm not selling either, actually. We're not selling publications. And we will give you email addresses. This is freely available, and we can send you a copy of it. And it's called the Blueprint for Successful Stadium Development. And we've done this in conjunction with a firm of architects called GMP, who are one of the leading architects worldwide in stadium. They did stadium in South Africa. They did the Warsaw Stadium for the European Championships, and they're now in Russia doing various stadium there. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of background to where we see the stadium landscape, which is really why we did this publication. A little run through some of the aspects on the development process, which I think I'll try and draw out some more interest, rather than sticking exactly to the process, just comment on a few interesting points in there, and then some conclusions on it. Now, how this relates to what's happening in Hungary, I leave that for you to decide, because there are various stadiums here that are at various stages of development. So what we see in terms of the landscape of stadium in Europe is that stadiums are getting older. There are many stadiums which are in excess of 50 years old, and there are many between 30 and 50 years old across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. This research here doesn't include renovations, I will admit that, but it shows that there is generally an aging population of stadia across the region. Ownership is an interesting thing, because in many, many countries, stadium are publicly owned. I think this is an inevitability. If you look at what's happening in Hungary now, it's inevitable that the stadium can only be developed through public funds. But in some of the larger, let's say, footballing countries, and the two that come to mind are Italy and Spain, there's a growing impetus for football clubs to try and have some ownership in their own stadium. They see this as important to their own financial structure, and also the revenue potential that there now is on a stadium development. And that links quite interestingly to this whole issue of technology in stadia. Technology is playing a key role in how stadia are maintained today, so in terms of environmental systems, management systems, in terms of revenue potential, so we have things such as dynamic ticketing, which is completely changing the way people purchase tickets, cashless systems for buying food and beverage in stadia, and I think interestingly the whole viewing experience, where years ago I think the emphasis was really on how does one take the live experience to the television viewer, and now it's completely changed, because the question is how do you bring the television experience to the live viewer. And just going back to the Amsterdam story of last Friday, this is what was interesting for me. The result was somewhat interesting, but was the experience of watching football, which I don't do that often, I admit that. But for example, when we watch cricket, and maybe the game lends itself better to this, we watch the action and then we turn to a big screen and we watch the replay. So if you miss something, you see it immediately. And for me, seeing football in that stadium, if we were lucky, we saw the rerun of one or two of the goals, but certainly not near misses. And to me, that was quite a frustrating experience as a viewer. And I think the the experience within a stadium, because of technology, is now changing completely and has to change in order to keep people coming back or increase spectator numbers. So it's against that background that we've published this report, because we see that more stadium we built and stadium need to be changed. I've put here a couple of email addresses. Marzi, my colleague, is here as well. If you send us an email, we'll be happy to send you a copy of this. And what the report does is it looks at a process of stadium development. And what we've identified, which I think is common to the way many people see the stadium development process, is that there needs to be a vision. This goes into then a phase of planning and feasibility study, then into the permitting, design, construction, and then the handover to operating. The important thing on this is that whilst there might be overlap between the stages, there needs to be a clear decision at the end of each stage before you can fully move forward onto the next stage of work. And I can think of many examples, certainly from the UK, of football stadia which were planned but didn't have a decision at the end of one of these and didn't go forward, especially when we come to the whole issue of vision, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Likewise, I think a key thing is to have the right advisors and the right participants in the project at the right time. And again, there's an overlap in this. We would certainly look in the work that we do on planning and feasibility to have an operator involved in that, possibly the architect involved at a very early stage. And of course, there's many other specialists that need to be involved in this. So going on to the process itself quickly, well, the vision, there's always a project initiator. It can be local government, it can be municipality, it can be the football club itself. But what's really important is that the various stakeholders involved in that project are involved in creating the vision. And I think this is where we've seen certain projects fail at an early stage, where, for example, the fans of a football club have not been involved at this stage and are not on side with a vision. There have been examples of that with Chelsea, with Liverpool, Everton, where basically the fans have not wanted what the club wanted or what the municipality wanted. This is an interesting example from the partner that we had on this project, GMP. And this was an interesting, even at the vision stage, because there was an impetus for a completely new stadium in Berlin, but at the same time there was a huge lobby that didn't want to get rid of the old Olympic Stadium. But they managed to come together and create a fantastic renovation of the Olympic Stadium, new roof, new seating, more corporate hospitality. And I think that's where a successful vision came together at a very early stage. Moving on to planning and feasibility. This is obviously a core area of the work that we do, and one that we would strongly recommend and argue has to be done by an independent body. You can't have operators doing this because they have an agenda that goes beyond purely analysing a project from an independent point of view. Again, certain stages that we would go through with this, starting with a location site assessment, what is the infrastructure available, transport links, planning regulations, these sorts of things. Going into market analysis, then trying to come together with a concept before going into sort of doing operating projections, and then looking at the key question of how is a stadium going to be funded. In terms of market analysis, well, the obvious things such as the political, social, economic environment, what's the demand, what are the supply of competing venues, and what is the expenditure patterns of say, the fan base. These are important inputs into any sort of market analysis. But of course, then you take the whole issue of technology and things like dynamic ticketing and new ways of buying food and beverage, and suddenly you can't take historic numbers in terms of attendance and expenditure. You have to apply what will be the impact of the changes that technology can bring. And based on the market analysis, based on the site analysis, based on what the funding possibility might be, and also the needs of the stakeholders, we would try to then pull together a preliminary concept. And the concept would be things such as the capacity, whether it would be mixed use, multi-use, the level of corporate hospitality, and start to look also at the operating model. And I think that is a really key part of any stadium development, is how it will be operated, and we'll touch on that later. And I'll just say a few words on some of these points. So the whole issue of whether a stadium is multi-purpose, whether it is a mixed-use development, is absolutely key to how stadiums are taken forward at the moment. So suddenly, if you have a closing roof on a stadium, which an increasing number of stadia do, whilst expensive, it is a increasing number that have closing roofs, it changes the events that you can put on there. The second picture is a stadium in Holland where they actually slide the playing field out to allow different events to take place on the ground, and then they can slide it back in. And of course now, for example, hotels attached to stadiums is quite a common thing. This changes the whole nature of advisors on projects like this, because suddenly you can't just be a stadium advisor, you must be a hotel or a real estate advisor as well. So this whole issue of multi-use, mixed-use development is very important. The corporate mix, this is interesting as well, because research shows that more and more corporate seats, premium seats, are being put into new stadia, so the mix is changing. And of course, this is where big money is generated by the sale of premium seating, corporate boxes, corporate hospitality. But from my own point of view, I think this is quite a dangerous thing as well, because you increase the amount of corporate hospitality at the expense of the sort of die-hard fans. And part of the experience of going to a live event are the fans, the noise they make. I'm going to come back on noise, by the way. This is very interesting. It's the noise that they make and the atmosphere they create. And a really good example of this, I think, is at Manchester United. Actually, it's an interesting example because it's a very old stadium, which is now currently one of the most modern stadia because of the renovation that they've done at Old Trafford. But last year they had to bring in an acoustic consultant because the atmosphere just isn't there anymore. And I think this is very important in terms of getting the mix between how much corporate seating and how much you allocate to the fans, as I say, who provide the atmosphere in a stadium. And at this stage also we would look to benchmark the cost of stadia. And how we would do this is KPMG maintain a database of stadium development costs. We're not looking to do detailed costings at this stage. We would look at stadia that might have some commonality with the stadium that we're looking at or the project we're looking at, and we would adjust it in terms of what facilities are in there, try and find a benchmark, adjust for some sort of local pricing issues as well, and reach an estimate of construction cost on the basis of that. So then we have the concept which is beginning to take shape, and we would then go into the whole issue of detailed financial projections and the financing of stadia. This is sort of a cycle, because by the time you get through this and you get down to funding, have you got the money? Well, no, not that, or how are we going to do it? Then we might have to go back, revisit the concept. So this is what we call our refinement cycle. The operating projections of a stadium, well, that depends on quite how the stadium is structured, but obviously the revenues of a stadia now go beyond just the sort of core usage of ticket revenue, corporate hospitality revenue, and quite often can go into the likes of rental agreements for different spaces of within the arena or attached to the arena. So the actual the revenue stream is a much larger thing than literally just tickets and these sorts of things. The operating cost, this is why we would sometimes look to have an operator involved with us to reach some sort of operating profit projection, hopefully. And then it comes to the key question of financing. And I think what's true to say here is that stadium today are seldom, seldom, let's use that word, a matter of sort of equity and debt. Stadium financing requires real creativity in order to bring together ways of having private sector money contribute to stadium development. One of these is, for example, securitization of future revenues. whether it be catering contracts, corporate hospitality contracts, and of course naming rights, which is a very hot topic. And this is quite interesting because it shows in two big markets in Europe the average price per seat of current naming right deals. And it shows there's quite a big difference between Germany and the UK. But of course, compared to the US, which is the home of naming rights deals, the gap is even larger. Well, I think there is only, to my knowledge, are there any? I know we looked one of the projects I was involved in a long time ago, 18 months of my life, was the Budapest Arena. And we looked at all of this. But then you're in a difficult situation there because, okay, that had private sector money involved. It was one of the first real examples of a PPP project that was done in Hungary. So there was private sector money in there, but the bulk of the money was state money. Then you have the whole question of, does the state want to maintain the name of it, calling it the National Arena, or, as they did, naming it after a... But there was money left.
Yeah, but this perfect theoretical background that you give us is, well, it's nice.
It's a decision. It's a decision.
Since most of the money comes from the government.
Yeah. I mean, we looked at that, and it was a government decision not to do that. Was there money left on the table? Probably yes, but that's a political decision. So we certainly looked at it, don't worry. But as I say, seldom debt and equity, and a great deal of creativity required. And therefore, in terms of the feasibility of a stadium, what we're looking to do is put together operating projections, an estimate of capital expenditure, looking at what funding sources are available and the terms of those funding sources, and also the requirements of shareholders, the expectations of shareholders. And from there, the stadium moves from a sort of concept towards a design brief. This goes into quite a lot of detail on the design. The great news is I'm not an architect, I'm a financial advisor, and I'm not going through it here today. So you're safe on that. But what we did do was we asked our architect partners on this to pull out some trends which are influencing stadium design today. So I'll just touch briefly on those three. One of them I've touched on already is this whole issue of roof technology, which is really a game changer for stadia. And as I say, whilst expensive, I think is always something that's now worth looking at. It was interesting, just a quick reference to my experience of Amsterdam, that the roof was shut for that day, which made it an interesting experience. That might be another noise question. Interestingly, when England played Wales, which for me is more interesting, in the final game of the Six Nations rugby, it's up to the away team to say whether they want the roof open or closed. And England, the away team, chose to have the roof closed. And the Welsh went, oh my God, yes. Because the intensity of the noise is just, huge. So they reckon I think they were 15-0 up in the first 20 minutes, and it was the noise. None of the England players had ever played in the Arms or in the Millennium Stadium before. So it was quite interesting. But the roof is certainly a big issue in the design question now. This was touched on as well, the whole issue of what can a stadium do from a social point of view. And there are some great examples. These were two of the stadiums that GMP did for the South Africa World Cup. And you can see that they are really having a huge impact on the cityscape of those particular. That's Cape Town, this is Durban. And I think also it would have been interesting, I didn't put it in here, is this whole issue that stadium can start to regenerate areas. There's a piece of research in here which we should visit again and look at as to whether there was this trend to move stadium outside city centres. And we see slightly that there's a reverse of this now, that actually you want to bring stadia into city centres because they can regenerate urban areas. Arsenal Stadium is a great example of that. And then the Warsaw Stadium is up there just purely because of the way they used it in terms of creating a national identity. And sustainability is interesting. This is one of the stadium in Brazil, and there's some interesting features about this. It's on the site of the old stadium. I think that's a given in terms of environmental consideration. It uses a lot of the materials used in the demolition of the old stadium in creating the new one. It is primarily using local materials to the greatest degree it can. It has systems such as the whole of the water requirement for the stadium during the World Cup will be through collected rainwater. I'm not sure that's of the service water aspects of it. And they've introduced things whereby they have special parking areas for certain cars of a certain emission type. So environmental considerations now play a major part in stadium design. Likewise, I'm not a construction expert, so we're not going to go through the detail on construction, which again is touched on in here. One area that a company like KPMG would advise on is the contracting for stadia. So we look at in some detail the different types of construction strategy that one can consider and what the benefits of each one are. So in terms of, for example, these diagrams at the bottom are looking at the different risk areas. So in a design and build, you're probably going to get the best cost, you'll get the best timing, but you give up control on what is actually built because you're literally handing the whole project over to a contractor to take on the whole contract, including the design and the build, obviously to a specification. The more traditional one, whereby you do separate contracts with each party involved, keeps the quality risk lower, the cost risk lower, but will take longer to do. And then a construction management, where you bring in a project management to manage the whole thing, has benefits in terms of time and quality, but might end up being the most expensive. So the publication goes into much more detail on these. And then we come to the issue of operating. I think this is a key issue because I think it's where owners of stadium, which are football club, municipalities, governments, have to look to find the best way. What we've done is identify the three sort of core, basic operating possibilities that exist. So a lease agreement, in other words, you take the stadium, you lease it to one entity. A management agreement whereby you would bring in an operator and they would operate your stadium for you, or you actually form your own operating company. And there are benefits and weaknesses of all three. And I think in reality what actually happens is some sort of hybrid whereby you might lease parts of the stadium, operate some yourself. It really depends at the end of the day on what's included in the stadium and what is the core expertise that's required, because a football club wouldn't be the best person to be operating a stadium where actually it's really important that you would have concerts or conferences and this sort of thing. But I think this is a really important aspect, not only in terms of making the stadium successful, but also when you then link it back to the financing and the overall financing requirements of a stadium. So in summary, what we saw in our research that we did for this was that there is certainly proven benefit in maintaining a robust process. So by finishing a phase, making sure there's a decision before moving forward to the next, that every aspect of a stadium concept needs to be justified through detailed analysis. But at the same stage, with the way that stadiums are changing and the differing requirements of different stakeholders in any project, you need to keep a degree of flexibility in what is put into a stadium, but most importantly that there is a need for creativity in terms of financing structure. So thank you for your attention. As I say, email us and we'll send you a copy of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham. Van esetleg kérdés Mr. Grahamhez, illetve közben már elhangzott, de...
This is really a brilliant theoretical background. Would you comment just a little bit
on the recent stadium developments in Hungary?
I'm really interested. It sounds like
Yes and no. Okay. I think there are certain interesting things. I think that there has been a process that has been followed. I think there needs to be agreement among stakeholders. You'll know better than me whether there is. I don't know the answer to that. But there needs to be in order for the project to be successful. There is proven evidence that there is a so-called new stadium effect. At the end of the day, I'm not, as I've said before, an expert on football. But for us, the new stadium effect is that more spectators will go to a stadium to an extent, irrespective of results. Okay? Obviously, it helps if results are like this. You know, the whole thing gets momentum. But there is a new stadium effect. What I can't say is whether there's a new stadium effect on playing. That's not something we've researched. I'm a bit worried about the noise question. I'd like to come back once more to that. You know, because the idea of a new stadium would be to create atmosphere, because that's what you want. And if you are a non-noise performing country, that worries me a little bit. I'm English, I'm British. We're told that we now specialise in sports where you can sit down. Okay, so we are very good now at cycling, rowing, sailing. So anything we can sit down at, we're brilliant. So you don't like noise, we like to sit down. That's the...
Actually, don't worry about the Hungarian spectators. I mean, they could be noisy.
Can they?
Yeah,
Well, actually, to be honest, they were quite noisy. I mean, at least in the beginning stage, they were good. I mean, there were not that many spectators in Amsterdam. They were in one tiny pocket up there. But you're right, they were...
Actually, it depends on the quality of the play.
That I can't comment on. It was interesting. I mean, the Amsterdam Arena, as I say, the technology, I think, I was surprised that it wasn't as good. Great example of a vision that was all, you know, because it was built originally with the idea of having a running track. Okay, then they changed mid-project that they didn't want a running track, but still the seats are too far away at the ends of the stadium. At the sides they're okay, but at the ends they're too far away. It should be much better if it was...